The sun was sinking low behind the jagged hills when the cowboy first noticed the man lying near the dry creek bed, his body little more than skin and bone, wrapped in torn buckskin and dust, breathing so shallow it was a miracle he was still alive. And the cowboy, known in the county as Elias Turner, a quiet man with rough hands and a harder past, should have ridden on like most men would have. Because these lands were dangerous, because rumors said native warriors roamed at night, because helping one could bring death to his door. But something in the man's eyes, when they fluttered open, stopped him cold. A look not of threat, but of desperate hunger and silent dignity. And Elias dismounted, kneeling beside him, offering water from his canteen, watching cracked lips tremble as the stranger drank, like a man pulled back from the grave. And when Elias lifted him onto his horse and carried him toward his barn, he had no idea this single act of mercy would echo across the plains like thunder. Inside the barn, Elias laid the native man on clean hay, fed him broth, warmed him by lantern light, and learned through broken words and gestures that the man was called White Fox, a scout separated from his people after days of pursuit and starvation. And as the night deepened, Elias sat with his rifle nearby, not out of fear of White Fox, but of what might come looking for him. And as dawn broke, White Fox's strength slowly returned, yet his eyes carried worry heavier than his wounds. And when Elias offered him food for the road, White Fox shook his head, pointing east, then drawing a line across his throat, a warning clear as day. But Elias simply said, "You're safe here," words he had never spoken to anyone before. And as the day passed, neighbors rode by, whispering, watching, suspicion thick in the air. And Elias knew helping this man would cost him everything, his land, his life, or worse. But when night fell again, a distant rumble crept through the ground. Not thunder, not wind, but hooves, hundreds of them, and Elias stepped outside his barn, lantern shaking in his hand, only to freeze as shadows filled the horizon, torches flickering like fireflies of war. And then they appeared, rows upon rows of native warriors, nearly 200 strong, painted faces glowing in the firelight, horses breathing clouds into the cold air, bows drawn, spears upright. And Elias stood alone between his barn and the approaching force, heart pounding like a drum, knowing that whatever came next would decide not just his fate, but the meaning of the choice he had made. And if this story is already pulling you into its grip, remember to subscribe to the channel, because stories like this, stories of courage, humanity, and destiny, are just beginning. The warriors stopped just beyond rifle range, their silence louder than gunfire, and Elias could feel every breath, every heartbeat as the lead rider dismounted, an elder with silver-streaked hair and eyes sharp as winter stars, who raised his hand not in threat but command. And from the barn behind Elias stepped White Fox, now standing tall despite his weakness. And when the elder saw him alive, a murmur rippled through the warriors like wind through grass. For White Fox was not just a scout, he was the son of their chief, believed dead, mourned for days. And as White Fox spoke, his voice carried across the field, telling of the hunger, the chase, and the cowboy who saved him when death already had its hands on his chest. And Elias stood there stunned as the elder approached, placing his hand over his heart in a gesture of respect rarely shown to an outsider. And one by one the warriors dismounted, forming a line before the barn, not to attack but to honor. And the elder spoke words Elias did not understand, but the meaning was clear. When 200 warriors lowered their weapons in unison, pledging protection to the man who chose mercy over fear. And from that night on, no thief, no raider, no gunman dared cross Elias Turner's land, and his barn became a place of legend, where two worlds met not in blood, but in understanding. And years later, travelers would stop to hear the story of the cowboy who fed a starving stranger and gained an army without firing a single shot. A reminder that the smallest act of kindness can summon the greatest force of loyalty. And as Elias watched the warriors ride away at sunrise, he realized he was no longer alone, not in the world, not in history. And if this story moved you, inspired you or reminded you of the power of humanity. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because every subscription helps bring more powerful stories like this to life. Stories that prove courage doesn't always come from a gun. Sometimes it comes from a bowl of food, an open barn, and a heart willing to help. Years passed, but the night too. 100 warriors, lined up outside the barn, never faded from Elias Turner's life. Instead, it grew heavier with meaning, shaping every dawn and every shadow that crossed his land. Because protection is never free, it carries responsibility, and Elias learned this when trouble came, wearing the face of greed. As word spread beyond the plains that alone Cowboy lived under the unseen shield of native warriors, and where men hear protection, other men hear challenge. And so one autumn morning, a group of hired guns rode in from the south, sharp-eyed, well-armed, and convinced that myths were nothing more than stories meant to scare weak men. And they laughed when Elias met them at the fence line, telling him that whatever deal he had with the tribes meant nothing to bullets. And Elias felt fear then, real fear. Not for himself, but for the fragile peace he had helped build. Because violence would poison everything, and he refused to draw his gun, even when they threatened his life, choosing instead to walk back toward his barn, a move the gunmen mistook for surrender. But the ground answered before Elias ever turned around, a low vibration rising through the earth like a heartbeat, and the laughter behind him died as quickly as it began. Because from the ridges and trees, from the tall grass and distant hills, warriors appeared, not charging, not shouting, but standing. Dozens upon dozens, bows drawn, rifles steady, faces calm and unafraid. And the leader of the gunmen realized, too late, that protection does not always announce itself until it is needed. And they fled without firing a single shot, leaving behind only dust and shame. And that day, Elias understood something profound, that kindness does not make a man weak. It makes him a bridge, and bridges are guarded by both sides. Seasons turned, and Elias became a quiet symbol of unity. His barn a place where food was shared, stories exchanged, and mistrust slowly unlearned. And when sickness swept through the valley one winter, it was native healers who brought medicine to nearby settlers. And when drought returned, settlers shared grain without fear. Because one starving man once received help when no one else would. And all of it traced back to that single night, that single choice. And in his old age, Elias would sit outside his barn, watching children, native and settler alike, run through the fields without knowing how close their world once came to burning. And when he finally passed, warriors came again, not in silence this time, but with songs of honor, standing in a long line outside the barn one final time, proving that mercy can outlive violence and courage can rewrite fate. And if this story has carried you through fear, hope, and humanity, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, because stories like this matter, and the more people who hear them, the stronger those bridges become.